All right, thank you. So, good morning, everyone. My name is Jaela. I'm one of the ID pharmacists over at the VA. So, this presentation on vaccine hesitancy, I like to call it a pre COVID topic. So, it's something I developed earlier this year. I think I last presented it back in March, thankfully, prior to COVID and all of the publications and information we're dealing with now on vaccine trials. But I think what I'm going to cover in this presentation is very interesting to now also view through the lens of COVID. So, a key predictor of acceptance of a vaccine by someone who's vaccine hesitant is the recommendation by a trusted healthcare provider. So, when providers can communicate effectively about the value of vaccines, the need for them, and their safety, we know that people tend to be more confident in their decisions. So, however, in order to do this well, healthcare providers have to be confident themselves about the safety, effectiveness, and importance. And recent research is showing that there is a proportion of healthcare providers who themselves are vaccine hesitant in their own professional and personal lives. So, I sort of like to ask you as the audience, are you willing to engage on social media with vaccine hesitant people, with a family member, with that friend from high school, with a complete stranger in a group that you may be in? And if not on social media, what about a patient just that's in front of you in clinic that has questions about vaccines? So are you willing to put yourself out there as a source of information in a confident manner? So when we talk about vaccine hesitancy today, it's really not so much about patients, but about providers. So I want to go over a little bit on the role of individual choice versus societal good and kind of go into the history of vaccine legislation. Go over some proposed responses to common vaccine questions that we see come up, on the internet, conversations with people, and then hopefully end this talk with some information on ultimately how to engage, whether that's on social media or in person with patients. So, first things first, I really don't want to talk about autism today, but I feel like we can't have this conversation without at least addressing this study that was published in The Lancet back in 1998 by the notorious Dr. Wakefield. So it was an uncontrolled case series. And does anyone have a guess about how large the sample size was in this original paper?
200.
Great guess. Anyone else want to venture lower or higher?
I said 100.
100? Great. Okay. 12. There were 12 cases in this original paper that really I was just sort of floored when I saw that information about this one paper that has created essentially a myth that has endured for more than 2 decades now. The other thing that I found just sort of very interesting about this is that the Lancet did not retract this paper until 2010. So it took over 12 years before they retracted it. And so it's really interesting to think about this, not just from, scientific information that was, flawed and influenced by, financial interests and so forth, but just the idea of loss of confidence as medical professionals in a medical journal and in the peer review process, which again, if we put our COVID lens on, I think is something we're sort of all experiencing right now as well. So it's always fun to look at vaccine history, and I really highly recommend checking out this website, historyofvaccines.org. It's just a very lovely site, very well put together, If you're sort of into the history of immunology and vaccines, there's a lot of interesting things on here. But of course, we're all familiar with, Edward Jenner coming up with a method for protecting against smallpox and sort of being famed for coining the term vaccination back in the 18th century and 19th century. Some other interesting time points on here when we see the first laboratory vaccine developed. It wasn't until 1945 when we had an influenza vaccine approved, which is sort of interesting to think about in terms of, the flu pandemic of 1918 is all on our minds right now. And it was still several decades before we had a influenza vaccine. So I don't need to tell anyone in this group about why we immunize, but we know that along with sanitation and clean water, vaccines are estimated to have saved more lives over the past 100 years than really any other health intervention. And so when we look at, this comparison of 20th century annual morbidity compared to at least data from 2018, we can see the percent decrease, due to the vaccine. So this is how we know why and how vaccines are so effective. But of course, paradoxically, with the success of vaccination, new generations are often unaware of the risks that these serious diseases had. And now their concerns are more sort of focused on the perceived risks of the individual vaccines rather than the disease themselves. So as I was, originally preparing for this talk, I really liked this sort of visual snapshot that you get in PubMed, and it's kind of a new feature of that PubMed has. But, kind of transitioning into this new lingo, and the term vaccine hesitancy is sort of very sort of the new term that we're hearing. And I think this visual really speaks to that. If we go back to 2007, there were only 3 publications at the time with the vaccine hesitancy name. But by 2017, that had increased to about 163 publications. If you may remember, around 2015 is when there were news reports about measles outbreak at Disneyland. And I think that's, obviously one of the key things that sort of started increasing this topic again and leading to this term of vaccine hesitancy. And so we can just sort of see it's been an exponential increase over the past few years. So what is it? What is truly the meaning of vaccine hesitancy? So at the simplest terms, it's reluctance or refusal despite the availability of vaccines. So in 2019, the WHO claimed vaccine hesitancy was one of the top 10 threats to global health. While acknowledging that vaccine hesitancy is a very complex topic and there's no one reason why people are hesitant about vaccines, but some of the main reasons can sort of be grouped into these categories of complacency, inconvenience in accessing vaccines, and also lack of confidence. So the term hesitancy is really, can also help us depolarize the camps of being either pro or anti-vax. And we should really acknowledge this hesitant group as being a heterogeneous group. And hopefully we can, really look at the individual concerns, with respect while being able to address people's concerns. So along with that kind of goes the idea of thinking about vaccine hesitancy on a continuum. And so we can imagine that there are hesitant individuals who may accept all vaccines but remain concerned about them. There are some that may refuse or delay some but accept others. And then, of course, there's the group that will refuse all vaccines. And there's some estimates that group on the right-hand side that would refuse all vaccines is, maybe estimated to be around 3% of the population. The other thing that we can sort of take away from this is the idea of high demand versus low demand. And so we know that the risk of hesitancy is high when there are situations of passive acceptance. And so that's when we can sort of get into compliance by a public, and sometimes maybe just sort of yielding to recommendations and social pressures. In contrast, when vaccine demand exists, which we can think of maybe right now, like if there's high demand for a COVID vaccine, theoretically, the risk of hesitancy is much lower when demand is high. So why not? Why do people not want to get vaccines? What are some of the determinants of hesitancy? And so you hear me sort of reference to those 3 C's: confidence, complacency, and convenience a few times. But essentially, we can see that there's any number of concerns for vaccine hesitancy, some legitimate and some perhaps maybe less legitimate in our eyes. These are not ranked in really any particular order. So we can see obviously things from safety concerns, lack of education from healthcare providers, folks that feel vaccines are really unnecessary, fear of needles and pain, folks that think we just have too many vaccines. I think the inadequate research before vaccine licensure is obviously very interesting right now. COVID is just going to follow us through this whole presentation. But that's probably a very common talk right now among healthcare professionals. Will you get the COVID vaccine? Will you get it if it goes under EUA before it goes through FDA approval? And so it's a very, very interesting time to be a healthcare provider, because I feel like we are definitely going to be put under the spotlight of by the public. We've been telling folks for a long time how confident we are in vaccines, and they're going to want to see us demonstrate that confidence by getting this COVID vaccine ourselves, right? So the other thing about these determinants and hesitancy is they're really associated with both high and low education, as well as both high and low socioeconomic status. So there's not really a particular group of society in general that you could identify as being more susceptible to these determinants than another. So again, sort of thinking about things on a spectrum from vaccine rejector up to acceptor. So I think where we would really want to focus our energy is not so much on the vaccine rejector, and we'll kind of look at that when we get to some information I'll show you about studies that have looked at social media and anti-vaccine information. But we might agree as a group of healthcare professionals that those in the vaccine rejector camp, they might be lost, or they're just people that we really are not going to reach, and we shouldn't really spend our energy there. If we could direct our energy, it would be in this vaccine hesitant group who, they have questions and they're open to information, and they really just want that relationship with a trusty healthcare provider. All right, so let's get into a little bit of the law, ethics, and public health. I don't know how much we spend time in medical school and pharmacy school sort of going into this information. So in terms of the history of vaccine legislation, we know that Edward Jenner was, really largely responsible for introducing vaccination to the medical community. And as pretty much in the early 1800s, we started having widespread vaccination. And so by 1840, there were already laws starting to be passed to provide free vaccinations, as well as starting to outlaw previous practices of inoculation. Soon after that, we started having laws making vaccine compulsory for infants already within the first 3 months of life, and including punishment for parents equal to fines or imprisonment. And, so forth, additional laws sort of extending compulsory requirements to age, connecting vaccination requirements for school admissions. And so at the time, these laws were really considered a political innovation because you started to see the extension of government powers into areas of traditional civil liberties in the name of public health. And so pretty much as soon as you have vaccine legislation, you have anti-vaccination start to come up. And so as long as vaccines have existed, there have been anti-vaccination sentiments. And so they started really formalizing their resistance almost immediately. And so you had the founding of anti-vaccination leagues, really focusing on that infringement of personal liberty and choice. And then, of course, sort of adding in the anti-compulsory vaccination league, publications, books, journals, demonstrations. I just thought the idea of even in 1885 having a demonstration with 100,000 people, it must have been a lot for that time. Long-standing commissions sort of debating these issues, which ultimately at the end of the century led to a new vaccination act that introduced the idea of a conscious clause and starting to allow this idea of being able to have a certificate of exemption. So this is a lovely picture from a anti-vaccination publication. You can see really trying to get at the fear tactics, talking about the vaccine monster, who's covered in, sores on the body, sort of depicting the idea of inoculation. The publication kind of speaks to the idea of poor, helpless infants, so really sort of targeting on the fears of parents. So meanwhile, in the United States, we sort of followed suit in terms of our legislature. So you had some of the first US laws passed because we were having frequent smallpox outbreaks. So that led to widespread vaccination in the early 1800s. And then, of course, like we saw on some of the earlier slides, once you sort of go through your period of widespread vaccination and the disease goes away, you sort of go into that period of complacency where you have generations who are not familiar with the disease. So you're sort of seeing that play out, in real time over the course of a century. And so you started to see vaccine disuse come into play, and then new epidemics come up later in the century. So then states had to take it upon themselves to really start enforcing and passing new laws. And then, of course, it wasn't too much time before you had your anti-vaccination societies of America being founded, which I believe came after the fact of British anti-vaccinationists coming over to America and helping us form those societies. And so, of course, you had court battles and riots in America as well. So in the early 20th century, there was a smallpox outbreak, and the Board of Health in Massachusetts mandated that all city residents must be vaccinated. And so you had one resident, Henning Jacobson, who refused to be vaccinated on the grounds that the law violated his right to care for his own body, which is an argument we hear about a lot today. And so the city filed criminal charges against him, and he lost that court battle. And so ultimately he appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. And so in 1905, the Supreme Court found in favor of the state and ruled that the state could enact compulsory laws to protect the public in the event of a communicable disease. And so this was considered the first U.S. Supreme Court case concerning the power of states in public health. And so in addition, in 1922, you had another ruling that also upheld the ability for there to be laws requiring vaccines as a condition of school entrance. And so we see that medical exemptions have been allowed per the Constitution or laws, but ultimately philosophical and religious religious exemptions are not. So the right to informed consent. So ultimately, those objecting to vaccines often claim this right to informed consent, which we know is an important medical legal value. But does a parent's right to raise their children, justify decisions that place the community at risk? So this is sort of the ultimate idea of individual rights versus community rights or society good. So we know that, unvaccinated children and unvaccinated adults as well, put the wider public at risk. So which we know violates a basic ethical principle of not imposing harm on others. So if an individual's right ends at the point that its exercise jeopardizes the safety of others, should states allow parents to opt out of vaccines, or should we allow adults as well? So some people, sort of suggest that we just require a more rigorous process for claiming exemption and try to rely on behavioral economics to encourage compliance. So if it's harder to get an exemption, maybe people will just, say it's not worth it. So that's one thing that's been suggested. So we know that, ultimately we need laws to provide stability for society to function. And so we always are sort of up against this balance of freedom while safeguarding rights. So, these are some examples that I, tried to find, either in literature or, just other references in terms of, when do we sort of sacrifice personal rights for collective freedom? And so we know, at the airport, we are willing to, take off our shoes. We're willing to allow bags to be searched in order for that feeling of security and safety. I think driving is probably one of the best examples, just from there's like a multitude of ways that we've sort of accepted compulsory laws. Everyone has to have a driver's license. We have to have car insurance. Seatbelts is an argument I see brought up a lot with vaccines because, there's many people have argued against seatbelt laws as being an infringement on individual rights, but ultimately over, decades, people have accepted that, click it or ticket kind of thing. We know we have to obey speed limits and traffic lights. If you ultimately run a red light and kill someone, there's consequences for that decision to run that red light. Another interesting one, just with the idea of thinking about students and schools is, there are a lot of schools, including, my child's daycare, where you cannot bring food to school that has peanuts in it because of the, what about that risk of, one child who may be allergic to peanuts and can have a very, serious outcome. Well, how is that any different than, not vaccinating a child and allowing that child to go to school? So I think there are many other arguments that could be made and other examples that you can think of. But the idea of having, that argument of individual control over your own body, we think it seems very obvious that we should have that. But I've seen examples as well about, if a person has active tuberculosis, do they have a right to work in a restaurant or a hospital? And so ultimately, we do live in a society, we don't live in a vacuum. And so we do need the government to help determine limits between individual rights and community responsibilities. So in modern day, as far as the legislature goes, as of 2008, all states permitted medical exemptions for vaccines. At least 48 states allowed religious exemptions and 21 allowed philosophical or personal exemptions. And what we really saw is that between, the early 1990s up through 2004, you saw a increase, almost a tripling of the states that allowed these philosophical and personal exemptions. And the idea of even sort of coming up with a sort of what is the mean exemption rate, across a state or across the country. And, it really only sort of represents a part of the problem, because what we tend to see is actually you end up getting like geographic clustering of communities or areas that allow these non-medical exemptions. And so what we know based on how a lot of these diseases spread is that if you have this clustering of communities that don't vaccinate, is they just become these hot spots. And so you get this local accumulation of susceptible children that really increases the risk of outbreaks. And so more recently, as of last year, we're seeing sort of a shift back where some states are working to either eliminate or clarify religious exemptions, working to remove some of those personal exemptions, even reporting exemption rates. And so, this is definitely a positive, I think, for us. And some as well adding HPV as a required vaccination for school. All right, so that's sort of the recap on the history of ethics and legislation. So traditionally, when I did this presentation live, we got to play a little Jeopardy game that I put together, but sort of in the interest of this being a little bit more tricky over virtual, I'll just kind of play the game for you. We'll just go through some of these categories of common questions and, think about, how you would respond if you saw these sort of questions posed online or if a patient brought them to you. So natural immunity, we often hear people say, and we're, again, through that COVID lens, we're seeing this right now. Natural infections can safely provide better immunity than vaccines. So we know that, yes, natural exposure to viruses and bacteria provide larger amounts of exposure and can cause a larger immune response. Whereas the whole point of a vaccine is to provide the smallest amount of exposure necessary to build that effective immune response. So that's the whole point of these trials, is to determine, what is the minimal amount of antigen that we can give someone to build antibody titers that hopefully results in meaningful clinical outcomes. So yes, natural infection can result in better immunity, but you always have to consider the cost and consequence of natural infection. So obviously this table is, rather simplistic. We know that for these natural infections, these are some of the untoward complications that can happen. We know there's even more serious complications for some of these infections, disfiguration, scarring, hearing loss. We unfortunately could probably list death as a complication for, all of these infections. Interestingly, though, there are some disease states where the vaccine has actually been shown to be better than natural infection. So for something like the HPV vaccine, the high purity of the specific protein that's in the vaccine actually leads to a better immune response than the natural infection. And so similarly for these other examples, the way that the vaccine is developed and whether there's a helper protein or what have you, the vaccine actually is more immunogenic than the natural infection, and the immunity is longer lasting. So giving a child multiple vaccines at the same time, it just overloads the immune system. And so there's, different photos that I've seen floating around social media of, like a toy baby doll or a teddy bear that just has syringes sticking out of every available square inch as a way to, scare parents that we're just overloading the immune system. Well, children are really just exposed to trillions of foreign antigens from the time that they're born. We know that their bodies are just constantly producing antibodies. They are literally sticking their hands in their mouth and touching everything every second of the day. I have a toddler right now, so I witness this. And so what's really interesting is that, when you look at just like the number of antigens, and so it's nice to see this really quantified, whether it's the common cold, strep throat, and being able to compare antigens against childhood vaccinations. It might help some parents to kind of put this in context. If they're concerned that if it's actually a thing that you can overload an immune system. And so this is another table that has really shown, especially over the years as we've developed more vaccines and vaccines themselves have improved, that, there are some vaccines that really have, the equivalent of one antigen or a handful of antigen. And so when you talk about, getting, 3 to 4, sometimes 5 vaccines at a pediatric appointment, it still is just nowhere near the amount of antigens that children are exposed to on a daily basis. Vaccines don't even work. I think we face this a lot with the flu vaccine and that myth of it's not even effective, so why bother getting it? But we know that modern vaccines, they are very effective. There's nothing we can say that's 100% effective. Even to go back to driving analogies, there's this idea that you can be in a seatbelt, you can be in a car seat, and unfortunately in car accidents, sometimes bad things happen and maybe the seatbelt didn't work. But that doesn't mean that, we get into the car and just don't put our child in a car seat. We do it because we know it still reduces that risk that something bad will happen. But in fact, when we look at the success rate of vaccines, especially with our childhood vaccines, we know that they're very effective. And again, how do we know that? Because we can go back to this table and look and compare against previous mortality and morbidity data. All right, so then this would sort of be moving into that second category of our Jeopardy game with vaccine ingredients. And so, as providers, you just have to know about vaccine ingredients, and you have to be comfortable explaining them in relatable to patients as well as other healthcare workers. Every single flu season, I get asked about, a preservative-free flu shot. Which flu vaccine doesn't have preservatives in it? What's the egg-free vaccine? Is there a vegan vaccine? These are real questions, and they come from healthcare providers as much as they come from patients. And so we need to have answers about vaccine ingredients, because if we can't give people the answers, they will go to the internet, and the internet definitely has answers about vaccine ingredients and not the ones that we want them to have. So one of the questions that can come up is, why is there aluminum in vaccines? And so you see people, read the vaccine ingredients, and it's, listed in these very scientific nomenclature. And so, I would usually ask the fellows, like, why is aluminum in vaccines? Like, what is the purpose of it? And so it is not a preservative, which I hear sometimes. It is used as an adjuvant. And so different aluminum salts, like aluminum hydroxide, aluminum phosphate, have been used in vaccines for more than 70 years. They were initially used going back to the 1930s through the 50s in the diphtheria and tetanus vaccines, because it was found that it could really strengthen the body's immune response. And in fact, it helps us give smaller quantities of vaccines and fewer doses. So, you can tell patients and parents that, we can lower that number of antigens and lower that number of doses by adding things like aluminum as an adjuvant. So, of course, we know that there's aluminum in other products as well. Not only pharmaceutical products, but, over-the-counter type personal products like antiperspirants. And in general, even in food products, you may ingest up to 7 to 9 milligrams per day. So specifically for parents, you can see there's a table here of, the amount of aluminum that you might come across in vaccines over the course of 6 months of life compared to what a child would be exposed to, whether they're breastfed or formula fed. And so we know that, we can acknowledge parents' fears that, yes, aluminum can be harmful when it accumulates in the body in excessive amounts. But the amount that enters the body with vaccines is really undetectable. And as it enters the bloodstream, it's very quickly eliminated. And so these are all the different vaccines that can have aluminum in there. And so it's quite a number of them. All right, so formaldehyde. This is, a weird one for, the layperson because I think people are more familiar with, formaldehyde as being perhaps a preservative for, dead bodies or something they would think would be in a lab. And so we know within the vaccine process that, formaldehyde is used to help inactivate viruses, detoxify them. So ultimately, they aren't causing active disease. But we also know that formaldehyde is sort of just naturally occurring in our body, more so than what would be found in vaccines. And we know it can also be, you can just come across this in your everyday life with automobile exhaust, household products, even products that females use like mascara. Yes, we know that excessive exposure to formaldehyde can be linked to cancer. So, that's something that people can come across on the internet when they're Googling about it. But ultimately that happens, it's more so to be typical in people who have regular occupational exposure to formaldehyde. So there's been no evidence that links cancer to the small amount of formaldehyde that enters the body through vaccines. And so again, if you have a parent or a patient who's like really keen on quantifying things and numbers, there's been some math calculation here for, a child who weighs, 5 kilograms, the amount of formaldehyde that might be found in their circulation is as low as 1.1 milligram, which is already 1,500 times more than they would come across in a vaccine. So mercury or thimerosal, which is the big one, and this is the preservative. This is now only found in multi-dose influenza vaccines. So when all of the reports and all the media hype was coming out about vaccines potentially being linked to autism, it really sort of like honed in on the idea of mercury being the culprit for that. And so while we know that is not true and has been found to be not true, vaccine manufacturers, to their credit, worked to remove this product from every vaccine. And so the only place that you find it now is in the multi-dose flu vials, which we do have. And so if you have someone that is absolutely adamant that they do not, want a vaccine that has mercury in it, they obviously can get a flu vaccine that's a single dose syringe. So why do flu vaccines need to even have this preservative? So one of the reasons I've seen is that because the flu vaccine is reformulated every year, and we have to make millions of doses every single year. The most efficient way to produce that amount is in a multi-dose vial. And so anytime you need a multi-dose vial, you have to have a preservative in it. Obviously, we know that more commonly you're going to come across mercury from your diet. We also know that the mercury that is considered poisonous or toxic is methyl mercury, whereas the form that's used as a preservative is ethyl mercury. And because it's processed differently in the body, it's less likely to build up. And also, it's only used in very tiny amounts. All right. So the last category of the Jeopardy game was sort of a fun one of just idea of things that people read on the internet. So folks say, vaccines are just not tested enough for safety before use. And so again, this is where COVID is really going to put this to the test, right? Because pre-COVID, I could say that vaccines are held really to one of the highest standards of safety that we have for medications and pharmaceutical products in the United States. And so we have one of the safest, most effective vaccine supplies in history. I could tell people vaccines go through years of testing before they can be licensed, and they're just continually monitored for safety and efficacy. And so we could be very confident that, serious reactions are very rare, the risks are very small, and they have to be, weighed against the risks of actually getting the disease. And there was even a statistic that, vaccines are researched for an average of 15 years before approval. So there are a couple really interesting studies, and this one about, Web 2.0. And if we think back to the continuum and individuals who sort of fall in this vaccine hesitancy group, they are much more likely to be, spectators or perhaps lurkers in these online debates and online postings. And so this was a study that analyzed user comment threads to news reports on influenza vaccination. And of course, as we would expect, the comments are extremely polarizing. They concluded that these forums really just serve as echo chambers. It sort of called into question whether public health should sort of really engage in these online forums at all. And they also concluded that they can be damaging and they can reduce the intention to vaccinate. So another paper also sort of tried to talk about this idea of how words matter. And so even when we use terms like vaccine hesitancy, we know hesitant is sort of this idea of being slow to act or slow to proceed. And so parents can sometimes be offended by that term because parents think that they're very decisive. There's nothing like an angry mom in an online group. We all know that term, mama bear. They feel extremely defensive about defending their child's rights. And so this hesitant labeling, some can find it demeaning. Even herd immunity, people sort of maybe take offense to that idea of being compared to cattle. And so, using terms more like community protection or community immunity might be terms that are perhaps more relatable. We know that anti-vaccine, calling people anti-vax really doesn't promote dialogue, at least especially with the group that's maybe more in the middle. You'll hear people say, I'm not anti-vax, but I just don't want, the HPV vaccine or something. And so we sort of have to be careful as professionals if we're going to engage to use terms that still bring people to the table. Because remember, those people that are truly, truly vaccine rejectors that engage in conspiracy theories, those are folks that we likely can't and won't reach. So try to avoid putting labels that put people into very specific and narrow categories. This was another really interesting paper that looked at Twitter trends, and I have recently joined Twitter during COVID, so I'm, learning more and more about how it works. But this particular study analyzed about 10 years worth of tweet data and sort of categorized pro hashtags and anti hashtags. And really, what you can kind of see from this visual is obviously blue is sort of on the pro and this orange color is on the anti side. And you can see that kind of visual gap in the middle. And so what they found is that very infrequently do users kind of respond across pro and anti groups. And they ultimately just concluded that there's really ideologic isolation online. This is from that same study. I think it's a little bit more promising, maybe gives us some hope. We can see that over time, at least, that there was an overall increase in the number of pro-vaccine users on Twitter compared to anti-vaccine users. And ultimately, pro-vaccine tweets did outnumber the anti-vaccine tweets. So what do we do? Very few interventions have been shown to effectively reduce hesitancy. And that's because we think a lot of the interventions are sort of designed on this assumption that hesitancy is just due to inadequate knowledge. So if we just keep giving people information, it will convince them that this is the right thing to do. But really, the single most important factor is that one-on-one contact with an informed, caring, concerned physician. So when you're able to build a relationship with someone and they trust you as a healthcare provider, now you're more likely to impact their decision making. So patients are much more persuaded by stories and anecdotes about the successes of vaccines. Anytime we can give personal examples of people who have, been vaccine preventable illnesses, especially as generations don't have the personal experience and don't have stories of what those illnesses were like. So when physicians can, tell patients, I immunized my family, I received my flu vaccine, that is what gives patients the confidence in their safety. So we want to provide, that very clear message that vaccines are safe and effective and what can happen when you and your family are not immunized. So this case method is something I saw described that was a really easy way to think about how to frame your appointment or your conversation with a patient. So being able to corroborate what fear or what question the patient is bringing to you, share that personal anecdote, share some science, specifically in terms that a parent or a patient can understand, and then explaining and giving them a very clear advisement on the med. And so this is what that might look like, if a parent had a question about, do vaccines cause autism? So how you would sort of empathize with them and corroborate that, yes, there's a lot of information about that online and in the news. So for me, I like to make sure that I'm always up to date with information on the topic. And so forth. And so tell them, like, I've researched this thoroughly myself, adding in the science of what we know as healthcare providers, what we know about the numbers of studies that have been done, and so forth and so forth. And then giving your advisement about how, I would recommend that you receive these vaccines today or that your child receives these vaccines today. And finally, then I just wanted to leave you all with some resources that I have found very helpful, either for yourself or working with the public. So again, the History of Vaccines website, the WHO has an entire trust library on their website with information. Immunize.org is also a fantastic website that is also connected with the ACIP recommendations. And so even for every vaccine, they have like an FAQ page built on, a library of questions that people have submitted and answered. I constantly give that website to other pharmacists to help them with questions that they have. The Children's Hospital of Philadelphia is connected with Dr. Paul Offit. And so if you are familiar with him, he obviously does a lot of campaigning. If you've ever watched, Z-Dog MD or Doc Vader, he does a lot of online videos advocating for vaccine information. And he has had Dr. Paul Offit on his podcast or his show before. And so these are just some good information that you can share with the public. The CDC Instagram page as well is a good resource for parents. All right, so vaccinate with confidence. Remember the 3 C's. Finally, there's also a Medscape module. I wanted to point this one out because it's more focused on adult patients. And so it sort of goes through different scenarios that you might come across with adults, like specifically shingles vaccination, pneumococcal vaccination, and how you can make sure that the phrasing you use with a patient in clinic is a strong recommendation and not a hesitant recommendation. All right, so with that, I'm happy to answer any questions or certainly hear, any of your thoughts or opinions from the audience.